That's Officer and a Gentleman. Wow. And I did watch the whole movie.
Remember when one movie managed to be a love story, a boot camp drama, and a full-on tearjerker without breaking a sweat? Well, released by Paramount in 1982, An Officer and a Gentleman follows Zack Mayo, a cynical loner who shows up at Navy officer candidate school. Richard Gere plays Mayo, the candidate who has to get broken down before he can grow up. Debra Winger is Paula, the local factory worker who falls for him. And Louis Gossett Jr. is Gunnery Sergeant Foley, the drill instructor standing between Mayo and those officers' wings. Now, audiences came from the romance, but they stayed for the training, the heartbreak, and that famous factory ending. And today we're counting down 15 weird facts about an officer and a gentleman. And stick around for number 1, because the recruit who could barely drag herself over that wall was secretly the most jacked person on the entire set. Now, before we get started, like this video and subscribe to remember when. It really helps the channel. Now, time to report for duty. Number 15, the iconic ending almost got cut. Now, the final ending that everyone remembers almost didn't happen, and the guy fighting hardest to kill it was Richard Gere. By then, Gere had bought all the way into the movie's gritty, working-class realism. And a man in spotless dress white sweeping a factory girl off her feet like the cover of a paperback romance felt like betrayal of everything that came before it. He told Hackford flat out that it was the dopiest ending and they'd never use it.
Because I said, we can't shoot that scene. It's never going to work. Ever.
But they shot it anyway. Gere still figured it was dead on arrival. Hackford had his own doubts at first, until they ran the scene in rehearsal, and the extras playing the mill workers started genuinely cheering and tearing up.
All the women are crying, but they're like crying for real. And a lot of them are extras.
Pulling for Zack and Paula like it was happening to someone that they knew. Turned out, nobody was laughing. But the clincher was the music. When Gere finally saw the footage cut together with Joe Cocker and Jennifer Warren's Up Where We Belong underneath it, well, the scene that he had written off gave him chills. The dopiest ending in the script, well, that became the one that nobody who saw it ever forgot. Number 14, Louis Gossett Jr. made Oscar history. Gere had the title and the poster, but ask people what they actually remember from An Officer and a Gentleman, and most of them will go straight to Gunnery Sergeant Foley. And Gossett never let them be a cardboard screamer. Under all that volume was a man less interested in breaking the candidates than in finding out what they're actually made of. Terrifying 1 minute, and then quietly pulling for them the next. That mix is what turned a supporting part into the beating heart of the movie. The industry noticed. At the 1983 Academy Awards, Gossett won Best Supporting Actor and became the first black man to ever take it.
The winner is Louis Gossett Jr.
In more than 4 decades of that category, nobody before him ever had. All these years later, his performance hasn't faded. People still quote Foley and still feel the weight of him. And that win, it still stands as one of the most important things that the movie ever pulled off. Gere, he walked away a superstar. Gossett walked away in the record books. Number 13, Richard Gere was not the first choice, and he almost passed. Richard Gere as Zack Mayo feels carved into stone now. And it's not even close. Paramount spent months chasing other men, though, for that uniform. And once they finally landed on Gere, they spent months more talking him into wearing it. Now let's start with the strangest near miss. Before any of the big names got involved, folk singer John Denver was actually signed to play Zack Mayo. Yes, Take Me Home, Country Roads, that guy. Lined up for 13 weeks of getting screamed at face down in the mud. Thank God he's a country boy, right? Well, Denver fell away, and the role started bouncing around a who's who of leading men. Jeff Bridges, Christopher Reeve, Harry Hamlin, they all circled it. John Travolta actually got an offer and pass, which tracked since he'd already handed Gere American Gigolo, the role that made him a heartthrob. At this point, Travolta was basically running a one-man Richard Gere career launch service. But the hard part wasn't finding Gere. It was getting Gere to say yes. He read it, but he found it too soft and sentimental for his taste. He wasn't really interested. He came around for one reason. They let him tear the script open. He and screenwriter Douglas Day Stewart reworked it together, dragging Zack out of soft-focus romance and into something rougher, meaner, and a lot more real. Years later, Gere copped to taking the job for the money. Yeah, sure, Richard, that's exactly what people say right before the movie makes him a superstar. Number 12, every studio in town passed on the script. Before it was a box office smash and an Oscar winner, An Officer and a Gentleman was a script that nobody wanted. Douglas Day Stewart wrote it in the late 70s and then watched it make the rounds collecting rejections. Studio after studio, they just didn't see it.
8 years, and it had passed from studio to studio.
Nobody would touch it with a 10-foot pole, and the reason was...
By his own account, nobody would touch the thing. The part that stings is where the story came from. Stewart wasn't chasing a trend or a high-concept hook. He was writing his own life. He had gone through Navy officer candidate school, and the training, the culture, even Zack's romance with the local factory girl, Well, that came straight out of it. Paula was modeled on a woman that he actually dated during those 13 weeks. He wasn't inventing anything. He was remembering. What finally cracked it loose had nothing to do with the script itself. A writer's strike was bearing down on Hollywood, and almost overnight, finished scripts that were ready to shoot became the hottest thing in town. Stewart's had been sitting in a pile the whole time. Paramount grabbed it, they shot it in 1981, and had it in theaters by the summer of 1982. The script that everyone skipped turned into one of the most defining films of the whole decade. Number 11. The Navy refused to touch the movie. Military movies usually come with perks. The Armed Forces hands over jets, bases, and advisors to anyone telling a flattering story. An officer and a gentleman got none of it, because the Navy, they couldn't stand the script. When the studio sent it over for the military sign-off, the brass came down swinging. Too much profanity, too much sex, and a deeply unflattering look at its own people. The part that really set him off was Zack's father, an alcoholic, womanizing sailor, closely following by Zack himself, who spends half the movie as a scheming loner working angles. That's not exactly the image that they wanted hanging in recruiting offices. So the Navy gave him nothing. No access to Pensacola, the real home of aviation officer candidate school, which meant that they had to fake one from scratch. The crew headed up to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington. They took over Fort Worden, a long deactivated Army base, and then dressed it up to pass as a working naval air station. The Navy wouldn't help, but plenty of soldiers would. Off-duty servicemen and Marines from nearby Whidbey Island crossed over to work as paid extras, and a few real instructors coached the cast on the finer points, because someone still has to tell you which way the uniform goes on. Number 10. Debra Winger played her own agent. Now, most stars come with a battalion, your lawyer, manager, and assistant for the assistant. But Debra Winger, she just came as Debra Winger, fiercely independent and not much interested in Hollywood's rulebook. She negotiated her own deal for an officer and a gentleman without an agent. That's bold. Also, a mistake. She signed before seeing the final revised script. And doing it solo, she skipped the standard no nudity clause that most actors lock in. So when a major love scene turned out to require nudity that she hadn't agreed to, she asked to be covered up. And she got told no. It wasn't in her contract. So she was the one on the hook to shoot it as written. She did it under protest, miserable the whole time. Then the same scene nearly torched the release. The ratings board hit the film with an X over the Winger Gere sequence, which in the early 80s was close to a death sentence for a mainstream studio movie. Shut out of most theaters, frozen out of advertising, etc. Paramount appealed, tightening the framing of the scene just enough to satisfy the censors, and got it knocked down to an R. One of the decade's great date movies, built on a scene its star fought tooth and nail, and nearly buried by a rating that would have shut half its audience out. Number 9. Gere and Winger couldn't stand each other off camera. Anyone who grew up in the 80s bought Zack and Paula completely. The longing looks, the blow-ups, the ending. Now on screen, Gere and Winger made it look effortless. But off screen, they could barely stand each other. Winger never softened the story very much. She famously summed Gere up as a brick wall to work with, and she handed out plenty more colorful quotes over the years. Gere mostly took the high road, only ever copping to some tension and never firing back. The friction ran almost entirely one direction. Even their co-star noticed the split. In his memoir, Louis Gossett Jr. said that the chemistry was terrific the second that the cameras rolled, and then a completely different story the moment that they yelled cut. No screaming matches, there were no tabloid blow-ups, but two very different people who never clicked, keeping it professional and then going their separate ways at lunch, which somehow makes the finished film even more impressive, because none of that frost ever reaches the screen. You don't see two actors dodging each other. You see Zack and Paula. And then came 2011. Winger walked on stage at the Rome Film Festival to personally hand Gere a Lifetime Achievement Award. Thanked him, called him a great human, all the good stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for all your kindnesses over the years. And
he praised her right back, admitting that she'd always been braver in front of a camera than he was. A happy ending for a romance behind the romance. Just 29 years late. Number 8. Gossett trained like an actual drill instructor. Gossett was so convincing as Foley that for years, people swore that he'd been a real drill instructor. Nobody's that terrifying by accident. What they were watching took a month of actually living the part. Now, the whole cast got put through the ringer, to be fair. Hackford wanted real exhaustion on camera, so Gere, David Keith, and the rest sweated through a brutal boot camp regimen built to mirror what genuine officer candidates face, which is why so much of the heaving and the wrecked faces that you see, it's not acting. When you're actually smoked, you don't have to fake looking smoked. But Gossett took it somewhere else entirely. To build Foley, he checked himself into a Marine facility tied to Camp Pendleton for about 30 days. He ran the real program. He modeled his sergeant on the instructors that he studied there. how they moved, how they owned a room, how they could flatten a recruit without raising their voice, though Foley still found plenty of reasons to yell. He also had a secret weapon in R. Lee Ermey, the former Marine drill instructor who coached him on the cadence, body language, and the head games a real DI uses to break a recruit down and then build him back up. And Gossett wasn't coasting on craft. In his mid-40s, he pushed through the same drills as actors half his age. Hackford even housed him apart from the other actors to protect the spell. By the end, nobody's watching an actor play a sergeant. They're watching the sergeant. Hey, quick pause. After hearing about the other possible leads, could you imagine anyone else but Gere playing Mayo? Well, be sure to drop your answers in the comments, because we write back. And if you're enjoying this countdown, take a second to hit like and subscribe to Remember When for more deep dives into the movies and shows that we grew up with. Now, let's get back to the barracks. Number 7, that sunglasses guy from CSI? Yeah, he got his start here. Long before he was sliding on sunglasses in slow motion and walking off every episode of CSI Miami, David Caruso, he was just another candidate getting screamed at in this movie. He plays Topper Daniels, the recruit who panics and washes out after nearly drowning in the dunk tank simulator. You blink and you miss him. Caruso didn't. He pointed to this bit part as the one that finally got Hollywood to notice him, the stepping stone to NYPD Blue and a whole career of squinting at crime scenes. So the guy who washed out of training turned a few minutes of screen time into a leading man run. It's not bad for the cadet who tapped out in the dunk tank. Number 6, Foley was never written for Louis Gossett Jr. Strip Louis Gossett Jr. out of Foley and the whole movie just kind of sags, which is wild because Foley was never written for him. On the page, Douglas Day Stewart's Gunnery Sergeant was white, and the studio went chasing big names to play him. Jack Nicholson got approached, and he passed. Mandy Patinkin gave an audition that the producers loved, but Hackford didn't think that he fit. Something was missing, so Hackford went looking at the real thing. Down in Pensacola, he studied the men who actually decided whether college kids would become officers and pilots. And the instructors who commanded the most respect and fear on that base, they didn't match the picture in his head at all. That cracked the part wide open. You keep Foley exactly as written, and you lose the truth of who really ran those rooms. That made the search change direction. And that is when Gossett walked in. Hackford already admired his work, and in the room, Gossett mentioned that he'd done a stint in the Army as a ranger, so he knew military life from the inside. He got hired on the spot. The role that nobody had written for him became one that nobody else could have played. Number 5, Paramount was sure that it would bomb. Hey, quick trivia. What do E.T., Tootsie, and An Officer and a Gentleman have in common? They finished as the 3 highest grossing movies of 1982. The twist was that only one of them shocked everybody by being there, and it wasn't the alien or the man in the dress. When filming wrapped, nobody at Paramount was popping champagne. From the studio's chair, you could see why. No spectacle, no effects, no marketing hook, just a downbeat working-class romance shoot for around $6 million. It was a kind of small, unglamorous picture that a studio only greenlights because the shelf is bare, then quietly expects to vanish. When audiences got hold of it, it opened modestly. But people kept telling people, and week after week, the crowds kept coming. And by the end, it had pulled in roughly $130 million at home and $190 million worldwide off that tiny budget. Third for the entire year, behind again only E.T. and Tootsie. Number 4, one reel kick halted production for 2 days. By the time the cast reached the big martial arts showdown, they'd been drilling the choreography for months. Gere took it seriously, arguably too seriously. He'd come up through a taekwondo and kickboxing mix while Gossett trained in stricter classical karate. Different styles going nearly full speed. Neither, of course, wanting to hurt the other, but both wanting to look real. Then, it stopped being pretend. Locked in and frustrated mid-sequence, Gere caught Gossett with a very real shot to the gut. Gossett, in real pain and in real fury, didn't return the favor. He said he was done. He walked off the set, and he didn't come back for 2 days. That left production scrambling. To keep moving, Hackford brought in a martial arts double to shoot the wider angles until things cooled off. Eventually, Gere owned it. Gossett came back, and they finished the scene. Watch it now, and you never guess any of it happened. You just see Zack getting pushed to the edge, and the two stayed close for decades, right up to Gossett's passing in 2024, which is no small thing. Some people never forgive a bad review. Gossett, he forgave a karate kick. Number 3, TV turned Foley's famous line into nonsense. Anyone who watches movies on network TV back in the day knows the drill. A film cruises along fine until somebody swears, and then suddenly the dubbed-over dialogue sounds like it was written by a nervous robot. An Officer and a Gentleman has one of the most famous examples never aired. In the theatrical cut, Foley hears that Zack is from Oklahoma and fires off a crude two-parter. The only things that come out of Oklahoma are steers and, a slur for gay men. You could probably put it together. And then he sizes Zack up and lands the capper. I don't see no horns on your head, so that narrows it down. Nasty, but the logic holds. Steers have horns. Zack doesn't. So by Foley's math, that leaves the other option. Network TV couldn't air the slur, so editors swapped the lines to gays and strays and left the horns crack completely untouched. The problem is, a gay guy nor a stray come with horns, so I don't see no horns on you now rules out exactly nothing. Foley stops sounding like a drill instructor and starts sounding like a man running a very confused livestock operation. And the original insult wasn't even the screenwriters. Technical advisory Ermey, the real former Marine, pulled it straight from military slang. And then he recycled the exact same line 5 years later as Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket. We've got a great video on Full Metal Jacket, so be sure after you're done watching this one to go watch that one too. Number 2, the studio almost tossed Up Where We Belong. Now that soaring ballad over the ending of An Officer and a Gentleman, it's so welded, you like that, to the movie now that it's almost hard to believe that it almost didn't exist. Hackford wanted a big romantic song to carry Zack and Paula out. But composer Jack Nitzsche was stuck. He'd scored the film with his longtime collaborator Buffy Sainte-Marie and still couldn't crack the closing number. Until Sainte-Marie played him a rough melody that she'd been nursing for a personal song that she wanted to call Up Where We Belong. And that was the missing piece. The studio figured that her folk style was too niche to land a pop hit. So Paramount's music chief, Joel Sill, brought in lyricist Will Jennings, who watched a rough cut and built the words around her melody. Then Jennifer Warnes pitched turning it into a duet with Joe Cocker. Not everyone was charmed. Production chief Don Simpson heard the finished track and hated it. He was so sure that it would tank that he bet Sill $100 that it would go nowhere, while Eisner sent them out shopping for a replacement. Nothing better ever turned up, and with the clock running out, the song, it survived. It didn't explode out of the gate either, but it built slowly, week after week, and as the movie caught fire, it carried the single up the charts. By the end, it had shot to number 1. It sold 1 million copies and walked off with the Oscar and the Golden Globe. The thing that the studio tried to toss became the decade's signature ballad. And number 1, the struggling recruit, was the fittest on set. One of the most quietly satisfying moments in An Officer and a Gentleman belongs to Casey Seeger, the candidate who keeps failing the obstacle course wall. She falls behind, fights through exhaustion, and when she eventually drags herself over the top, you can't help but cheer. Now, here's the joke that the audience never got. The actress playing her, Lisa Eilbacher, was probably the last person on the set who'd struggle with a wall. Now, in real life, Eilbacher was an avid bodybuilder, arguably the fittest member of the entire cast. So while everyone else spent the shoot trying to look stronger and tougher than they were, she had the opposite problem. She had to convince audiences that Casey was physically overmatched, which meant deliberately killing her own posture, dragging her movements, and hiding the strength and stamina that she actually had. By her own account, the hardest part of the whole role was pretending to be out of shape. The wall sequence is where it really counted. If Eilbacher had just used what she had, Casey clears it in like 3 seconds and the whole emotional payoff just evaporates. But instead, she played every inch as a war. The frustration, the doubt, the pure refusal to quit, so that the climb, it feels genuinely earned. And there you have it, everyone. 15 weird and wild facts about An Officer and a Gentleman. Which one caught you off guard? Well, let us know in the comments, subscribe, and share this with a friend who still tears up at that factory ending. And don't forget to ring that bell. Until next time, we'll meet you up where we belong. This is Remember When.